Hello, everybody. My name is Reggie Ramos. I'm the Executive Director of Transportation for Massachusetts. We are very excited to bring to you today another stop of our Money Train learning series, where we seek to bridge transportation policy conversations with our everyday life. Today, we talk about a very important topic, transportation funding, without which public transit would not be possible. As always, we would like to thank our partners here at the GBH Network Forum for allowing us to use their platform so conversations like this reach a wider audience. We would also like to thank our host, as well as our guest panelists for today. And of course, all of you who are joining us on these conversations that impact our daily lives. We will be taking in questions in the later part of the program. And at this point, I would like to turn over the discussion to our host, Global Transportation Correspondent of the World and GBH News, Jeremy Siegel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, live here at the News Feed Cafe at the Boston Public Library and streaming on YouTube. To set the stage for this discussion, I want to look back nearly 3 years to November of 2022, more than 3 years ago. That's when voters in Massachusetts did something historic. We passed the Fair Share Amendment, commonly referred to as the millionaire's tax, which implemented a 4% surtax on incomes over $1 million. The revenue from this tax, it's specifically dedicated to spending on public education and transportation, which we're talking about today. We're going to just dig into the question of where things stand 3 years after this amendment was passed, looking at how Massachusetts is doing when it comes to transportation funding, what progress has been made since the passage of the Fair Share Amendment, what we have to show for it, and what's next for transportation funding and big projects in the Commonwealth. We have an all-star panel here that will discuss the achievements over the past few years, what the current needs are for transportation infrastructure, not just in Boston, but across Massachusetts, and also whether the state is prepared for huge events coming up next month, like the World Cup, and major projects like the Cape Cod Bridges and East-West Rail. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to let all of you know here in the audience and on YouTube that we will be taking your questions today. There's a microphone over here, sort of towards the center left of the stage. You can find my colleague Andrew over there. When the time comes, I'll let you know. He'll help you get in a line and get your questions asked. My colleague Annie over here will also have question cards available to you during our conversation if you prefer to write down your question. And then also, if you're streaming us live on YouTube, you can comment your questions, and Annie will make sure that I get those and we can put them to our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce everybody joining me today. Over here we have State Representative Lindsay Sabadosa, representing the 1st Hampshire District that includes the towns of Chesterfield, Plainfield, Westhampton, Williamsburg, the city of Northampton. Representative Sabadosa is a member of the House Committee on Ways and Means, the Joint Committee on Transportation, and served on the East-West Rail Commission, created by the legislature in 2022. Representative Sabadosa, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me today.
And in the middle here is Brian Kane, the Executive Director of the MBTA Advisory Board, a quasi-state agency representing the 178 cities and towns comprising the MBTA service district. In this role, he provides municipal oversight of the MBTA's capital, operating, and policy decisions on behalf of local governments. Brian Kane, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here, Jeremy. Thank you.
And here, Dr. Viviana Abreu-Hernández. Dr. Abreu-Hernández is the president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, a nonpartisan 501c3 organization where she oversees the production of rigorous research, people-centered policy and analysis, and strategic advocacy to advance policy solutions that promote racial and economic justice. Dr. Abreu-Hernández, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So Viviana, I wanted to begin with you for a bit of a primer on how transportation funding works in Massachusetts, because I think it's deceptively simple. You actually brought a graphic with us, which we can put on the screen here at the library. You can also see it if you're streaming from YouTube. I think this kind of illustrates how it's explainable maybe, but it's also very, very confusing. There are a lot of boxes and arrows up here for all of the funding for trains, roads, bridges, sidewalks, bike lanes. A simple question for you with probably a complex answer. How does transportation funding work in the Commonwealth?
I will say that it's not enough, and I think that the other panelists will agree with it. I think it's complicated. And I also think that we should talk about the advances that we have had specifically with the fair share. And that transportation particularly, and I have to acknowledge the wisdom and the research that Phineas Baxendale in Mass Budget has done. And he always calls attention to the fact that when we invest in transportation, a lot of the things that we do is to prevent things from happening. So one of the things that the fair share has done is to keep the MBTA running. So, and I know that Brian is going to be able to talk a little bit more about that, but there are a lot of different funds that go into the transportation system, that it is not only the MBTA, but also the regional transit authority bus systems.
There is a lot in there, and the big piece that we're talking about today is the Fair Share Amendment. Brian, I do want to turn to you because many people here might know that Governor Healy appointed a transportation funding task force that you are a member of to basically figure out how to fix transportation funding in Massachusetts, take stock of it all, and also what to do with the Fair Share Amendment. We've passed this huge amendment. It's been in place for years. It's a new source of funding. As of today, given the Fair Share Amendment, do you think that the funding needs of transportation in Massachusetts are met?
Not even close, Jeremy. Not even close. The Fair Share Amendment has done wonders for our transportation infrastructure and operations here in the Commonwealth, but it has largely allowed them to keep going in a post-pandemic, post-COVID environment. I think the voters believed, and I say this as a voter, we were voting for money to do new things, to make the system better. What the Fair Share money has actually allowed us to do is simply backfill deficits across the transportation network so that things don't get worse. And while things not getting worse is great, I happen to be one of those people that believes that we in Massachusetts can and should do better. This is the hub of innovation here in Boston, and this is perhaps one of the greatest places to live in the planet. We can do better than what we're doing right now.
I want to get into how we can do better in a moment, but Representative Sabadosa, I want to bring you into the conversation because right now, representatives and senators on Beacon Hill are discussing the next state budget.
Yes.
Are you thinking of similar questions that we've been talking about over the past couple minutes as you debate this funding? Obviously, transportation is only a portion of the Massachusetts budget, but the budget is the biggest thing all of you do every year on Beacon Hill. It determines a good chunk of the state of funding for transportation. What's going through your mind as you're debating this?
Well, so right now, if we look at we have to look at the state budget almost as two separate pieces of legislation. We have the Fair Share supplemental budget, which was about $1.7 billion, and then we have the FY27 budget, and the House has taken up both pieces of that. When you combine those, the Fair Share funding that we are spending in this budget goes about 45% towards transportation, and I think I would agree. A lot of the funding is being used to backfill, to bring things up to a better state of repair. When I come from Western Massachusetts, right? So when I think of Western Massachusetts, I think about bridges. When I first came into office, we got a report from MassDOT about the state of bridges in the Commonwealth. A lot of them were failing. We are working to reopen bridges that are in some of my communities that have been closed for years. We are trying to get other bridges up to a good state repair. We finally have a program for culverts, sometimes viewed almost as tiny bridges that prior to a few years ago, we didn't have any funding sources for. And then, of course, supporting our regional transit authorities and making sure that people can ride them because they actually run in the evenings and on the weekends, many of which did not prior to this funding coming through. So I agree there's a fair amount of backfill. I will say in looking at this year's budget, we were just really aware of a lot of things. I mean, first of all, fair share funding doesn't go to healthcare, but we know healthcare cuts are going to dramatically affect our budget moving forward because of changes in DC. We are looking at a potential ballot question that could dramatically reduce revenue. And so I think with this year's budget, what we've really tried to do is make sure that We are offering funding to programs. There may be cuts, but we are offering things to keep the bones there so that hopefully with different election results, the failure of this ballot question that would reduce funding, we can then continue to build. But I think we've really had that in the back of our minds through this budget, that even though we keep saying it's a tough budget year, things could and may well get much, much worse.
Do you feel a tension within the legislature when it comes to regionality of funding for transportation? A lot of our discussion today, I imagine, is going to focus on the MBTA. You have regional transit authorities. You were discussing some of the bridges that you're trying to reopen in Western Mass. Is there a tension between lawmakers? Like, we need to fix things out here, but people are obviously focused on the MBTA because it's such a big portion of transportation funding.
The word you are looking for is regional equity, and yes, there is a huge amount of tension. But what I will say I've come to learn is that although I will bring the Western Mass perspective today, and that's where my constituency lies, my colleagues on the North Shore feel this, colleagues on the Cape feel this, colleagues on the South Shore feel this. There's sort of this tension, I would say, between Boston and the Metro Boston area and the rest of the state to make sure that we're dividing funding in equitable ways. I've said to my constituents many times, I will never argue that the MBTA should not be funded and we should get all the money. It is really important that we lift all ships and we fund transportation across the state, because that's a successful Commonwealth, Commonwealth where you can travel everywhere. And so it is really important that we understand those give and takes, but we really, at the end of the day, want our fair share too.
Viviana, when we opened this discussion and we're talking about the broad state of transportation funding, you mentioned how important you feel the fair share amendment is to all of this and how much of a boost it's given. Brian pointed to some areas where not necessarily it's fallen short, but because of the state of transportation funding, we've needed to use it to essentially fill gaps.
Yeah.
Do you think the fair share amendment has been an overall success? Obviously, it's brought in a lot of money.
Yeah. So the fair share has overperformed since it was voted in 2022. So let me give you an example. Originally, I think that the state estimated a revenue of about $1.2, $1.3 billion in the first year, and it brought in over $2 billion. So far, I can say that since the first year, the fair share has brought in over $6 billion to be invested in transportation and education. So a couple of things. So explaining the budget, so the Committee on Revenue estimates how much money the revenue from the fair share is going to bring. And if there is an excess of that revenue that was captured but also budgeted, the government has the ability to pass a supplemental budget. So currently, the legislature is looking at the state budget proposal, which is about a $2.7 billion in estimated revenue coming from the fair share, but also $1.3 billion of over revenue that was brought in 2026. So just give you an example, for 2027, the governor's proposal is $975 million going into transportation. And of the supplemental budget is $789 million more for the transportation. So it's about, in this year, it's $1.764 billion just going to transportation. Imagine if we did not have the fair share. So one of the things that I want to call attention to is that, yes, the fair share is investing in capital projects, but it's also funding directly public transit users. So in all of the regional transit authorities, people are not paying for their bus service. So that's an equity-driven measure and policy that the state has enacted, because the revenue that the state gets out of people paying for their buses is one of the most regressive revenues, because the people that take the bus tend to be the low-income population in Massachusetts. So Providing free transportation has increased the users to before pandemic. That's number one. And number two, it has increased the efficiency of the public buses. And that is a portion of how much the fare share is being used in other aspects of that is not the MBTA. But these are also contributions to make sure that Massachusetts become more affordable, which is an issue that we have to discuss too.
The fare-free rides on the RTAs obviously has been huge, but Brian, here in Boston and the surrounding areas, folks are still paying for rides on the T. You mentioned how the fare share has essentially been used to fill the gap of T funding over the past couple years. As a transportation reporter, I feel like every year I've had deja vu all over again, where I'm writing the headline of the MBTA is facing a financial cliff, where they have hundreds of millions of dollars in a budget deficit. Since the passage of the Fair Share Amendment, a couple months later, I've been able to write the headline that the governor's budget, the state legislature's budget, has saved the MBTA by using fair share money. Transportation for Massachusetts, which is putting on this conversation, had a report several months back earlier this year about how, as the years go on, that's going to be more difficult. There's not going to be as much of that excess money from the millionaire's tax, which there's some complicated financial reasons behind that I don't think we'll get into. But when you look down the road, I mean, that's kind of a tricky situation where voters have passed this thing that's supposed to fund transportation and transportation projects in Massachusetts, but it's basically become the thing that over the past few years has just been used to save the T.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And you know, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. I also brought a graph. I don't know if we could
Yeah, let's put it up on the
possibly
screen.
show that. So you mentioned there's two budgets. There's a supplemental budget and an operating budget. The T also has two budgets, and this is its infrastructure or capital budget. And if you look on the screen, the orange is Massachusetts state dollars for MBTA infrastructure. And you can see that after 2030, it goes away.
Mm-hmm.
There is no state support budgeted for MBTA infrastructure or capital needs after the year 2030. And that is despite all this excess revenue from the millionaire's tax, which is absolutely keeping the T going. So you're right, Jeremy. The fair share money is certainly keeping the T's operating budget going, and it is allowing there not to be service cuts and not to be fare increases. But after 2030, there is no money programmed for any new infrastructure spending. And I should note, what is currently being funded by the Commonwealth is incredibly important. South Coast Rail, which opened last year, the new red and orange line cars, which I think anyone who's ridden the system knows are desperately needed. Green Line extension, new locomotives, new coaches, and when I say locomotives, I mean electric locomotives. So huge pieces of infrastructure and huge pieces of the future of Massachusetts are currently being funded by the Commonwealth. And as a T rider, I'm incredibly grateful for that. But I do look at that chart, and by the way, that's a T chart, that's not my chart. Mm-hmm. After 2030, I get real nervous because that's around the corner.
Representative Sabadosa, when you're having conversations with your colleagues on Beacon Hill, are they thinking about that future, that post-2030 date? I mean, you served on the East-West Rail Commission created by the legislature. That's an ambitious project that I think a lot of people have been wanting. Do you think there needs to be new funding that I mean, you said it's a difficult budget season, but should we be thinking about ways to ramp up funding
I mean,
for transportation?
I think that we should always be thinking of ways to ramp up funding. There's a lot of things that we would like to do in the Commonwealth that are going to be very challenging if we don't, right? I would say that we talk about funding for the MBTA regularly. I serve on the Joint Committee on Transportation, and it is one of the most pressing conversations that we have. How do we make sure that we are funding the MBTA, and how do we make sure that it is sustainable? But you brought up East-West Rail, so I would like to mention that. You know, I think East-West Rail is a project that is moving forward. I think it is important to think of it as a series of projects that are moving forward because it is complicated to rebuild a rail line across the state that has more sustainable service. There's currently only one train a day that travels out through Springfield, actually heads out to Chicago on the Lakeshore Limited line. But we have seen time and again, and I live in the city of Northampton. We have the Valley Flyer that goes down to New York. It consistently beats ridership expectations. So when you build these services, they do come. But the difference is really having federal partners who want to see that sort of service when it comes to larger projects like rail. And I believe that even with the MBTA, the federal government should eventually play a role in sustaining and supporting these major systems in cities of the United States.
We're going to get into federal funding in just a little bit, but I want to talk about some local considerations that are coming up right now. Massachusetts is hosting 7 World Cup matches this summer. This is also, as the Cape Cod bridges are scheduled to be replaced over the next 10 years, but on top of the World Cup, there's going to be America 250 celebrations. There's also going to be the tall ships in Boston. Brian, do you think we're prepared to face these challenges and also show the world that Massachusetts has good transportation, as we're going to be flooded with millions of visitors?
I mean, I absolutely believe that Phil Ang and the current leadership at the T will rise to the occasion and meet it. What my concerns are for things like that is we will be carrying hundreds of thousands of people, the T will be carrying hundreds of thousands of people to Foxborough Stadium on diesel locomotive trains that were built in the 1980s. Frankly, that's embarrassing. We are better than this. The rail line to Foxborough is a spur that is 1 mile from the electrified Northeast Corridor, and yet we are choosing to use diesel locomotives that run 1983 technology. Frankly, it's embarrassing. As a resident of the Commonwealth, how did we not know this was coming 10 years ago? Someone knew, they just didn't do anything about it. But with that said, we will meet the demands. I have full faith and confidence in Phil Ang. I worked at the T the last time the tall ships were here. We had an all-hands-on-deck approach. It will work.
Do you think there's a chance that meeting this demand will also give a blueprint for the future possibilities for the T? I'm thinking about, there's a recent story saying that the first match, which is on June 13th, it's going to be ending really late at night, like around midnight. And as a result, the T is going to be running commuter rail trains from Foxborough to Boston, coming back potentially as late as 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and then the subways, the Silver Line, are going to be operating until 4 a.m. that evening. Do you think that's something that, like, if it's successful next month, the T should be considering, hey, why don't we do this all the time?
Oh, 24-hour service. So this comes up every couple of years, Jeremy, and every couple of years I say the same thing. No. The T has 4 hours to get onto the right-of-way between the end of service at 12:50 and the start of service at 4:50. In those 4 hours, they need to do things like track repair inspections, electrical inspections. There's a ton of stuff that needs to happen in those 4 hours. The T needs that time. We have tried 24-hour late-night service over and over and over again, and it's failed every single time. Not because there's not enough ridership, but because it's too expensive. And I could tell you story after story after story of people that need it, yes, but I could also tell you story after story after story of people at the T who just sit there racking up overtime, which nobody wants to have, pay for most of the time. And I'll also say this, Jeremy, yes, the T will be running incredibly late night service for this game. I guarantee you the next day, my office will be flooded with phone calls from neighbors of those cities and towns who were woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning by a diesel train going by. It's another failure. Electrical trains are a lot quieter. We have to think this through holistically before we start doing things like, hey, let's operate 24/7. We're just not there yet.
Viviana, as we're thinking of these questions of how we can, in a safe way, expand service, make good changes, and also continue to fund transportation in Massachusetts, right now voters are going to see a ballot question this November that would reduce the income tax from 5 to 4% over 3 years, limit annual state tax collections in an effort to force more frequent taxpayer funds. If passed, this could result in a projected loss of revenue of 5.1 annual in state revenue by 2030. How do you think this question could affect state investments in transportation?
Short answer, buckle up.
Yeah?
Yes. So a couple of things. If these ballot questions get to the ballot, because there is litigation going on, if they get to the ballot, indeed, it's going to be more than $5 billion per year that the state is going to lose in terms of revenue. That is more than what the fair share will bring in. So the proponents of these questions are still upset about the fair share, and this is a reaction to the fair share amendment. So just think about $5 billion less. When we talk about Massachusetts budget, that is over $60 billion, but they are pre-budget transfers that we have to make. There is a lot of money that goes into matching federal funds. So losing $5 billion is a big deal. In addition to that, the amount of money that the state is going to lose because of changes at the federal level. So, for example, Massachusetts has not completely opted out of the corporate tax cuts given in the OBBBA. And that, without fully decoupling until 2034, Massachusetts is going to lose about $1.2 billion. So what the governor and the legislature, what they are considering and proposing is to postpone these tax cuts for 1 year. But, you know, I'm going to have to be advocating year after year to those tax cuts to corporations not to be embraced by the state of Massachusetts so the state can retain that revenue. So the state is also projecting that as of 2028, about a loss of $3.5 billion in Medicaid funding. And we are looking at approximately 300,000 residents of Massachusetts that are going to lose access to health care. Medicaid, and in other instances for changes to the ability to be eligible for Medicaid. So we are seeing a real crisis of revenue in the state of Massachusetts, just as what is happening at the federal level. Add to that ballot questions. And on top of that, we have not seen real progressive revenue lines coming in. And the state has choices. So the state can fully decouple from the OBBBA, and we can preserve those $1.2 billion. But there is also the corporate fair share, which is making sure that those corporations that are putting money in subsidiary corporations in tax havens are paying their fair share of taxes in Massachusetts. And we have not seen the legislature move forward to you know, like consider those two revenue sources. So it's going to be really hard. It's going to be tough. Losing $5 billion, imagine the fair share will not be able to make up that gap.
I want to talk also about the loss of federal funding in addition to the potential loss that could come from this ballot question. Representative Sabadosa, you know, in addition to some of what Viviana has mentioned, we've seen Congress rescinding funding for the big Alston I-90 project, the Trump administration canceling grants for funding across the Commonwealth. We've seen in Boston, Mayor Wu pull back on some potential projects because of a loss of federal funding. How do you think we should be viewing our federal partners right now under the Trump administration and moving forward, you know, with trying to actually get some projects done in Massachusetts?
Well, partner is a big word because they're not actually partnering with us. And so, I mean, I think we almost have to view them as adversaries at the moment because they are, as you say, trying to pull funding away from states. And let's be very clear, they're not just pulling away funding from all states. They're pulling funding away from blue states, or states that did not vote for the president in the general election, and that is quite obvious, I think, to all of us. So, I mean, I think, you know, I said earlier, we're going a little bit into a holding pattern. We're trying to understand what our options are, what potential there is. I mean, in every moment of difficulty, there are ways that we can move forward. Viviana had some suggestions of things that the legislature could do. I mean, that's not going to put all of those projects back online, but I think we try to figure out what we can do as a state, how we can partner with our neighboring states, and then, you know, we wait for better federal partners, for real partners, to come into office so that we can proceed with the vision that we have for the Commonwealth.
Jeremy, if I might, just two things. One is, right now, we don't really have a transportation vision for folks to sort of rally behind and get behind.
When you say we, you mean coming from?
The Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I couldn't tell you what the Massachusetts Department of Transportation's vision for transportation is and I've been looking at this for 20 years. But there's an opportunity here. There's a huge opportunity here. Massachusetts is poised to have some of the most senior leadership in the House, the National House of Representatives and in the Senate, assuming Democrats take back those places in November. We will have the deputy leader of the House, the chair of Rules, and the chair of Ways and Means, potentially, from Western Mass.
Yes.
The last time that was lined up like that, huge federal dollars were able to flow into the Commonwealth. We need to get ready for that. And I would also suggest that if there is an environment in which federal taxes are being cut, that is the almost ideal opportunity to increase state taxes and state fees so that people's net is basically zero. What better time is there for we here in the Commonwealth to think about how we want our transportation, but not just that, our healthcare system, our education system, all of our infrastructure to look, than in this time where we have the opportunity to actually put some money behind it. So I think we're not doing a good enough job of getting ready for the potential in November. Yes, we have challenges with this terrible federal administration, but we also have elections. At least I hope we do.
So there's potential at the federal level. I think a lot of advocates would say there's also potential at the state level. I wanted to ask you, Brian, about future funding considerations, because the task force that you sit on did come out with recommendations, which received some criticism from advocates, I think, for saying that overall, to probably summarize too much, what you came up with was saying we should use fair share funding to help transportation funding in Massachusetts, which was kind of already what has been happening. And I don't think there were any solid recommendations of we should do X to have more transportation funding, to have the transportation funding we need to keep the T afloat in 3 to 5 years.
Yes.
One big idea that's been floated is congestion pricing. We heard Boston Mayor Michelle Wu referencing the need to look into that. It's been very successful in New York. Are you supportive of that idea? Or is there anything else that you think should be on the table?
Well, let's be clear. Congestion pricing will not happen as long as the current administration is in the White House in Washington. You need federal oversight and approval to do that. That was one of the reasons why it took so long in New York City. If it does happen in Massachusetts, it'll be about a 10-year studying process. So whether or not it's a good idea, we can't wait. We don't have 10 years.
So what do you do in the meantime?
We need additional revenue sources that can generate actual cash today or tomorrow for infrastructure. Things like delivery fees for Uber and Lyft and Amazon and FedEx and all of the packages that we all get every day. Lots of states have put a $1 fee on that, and that money goes to support the infrastructure that those delivery services use, our roads and our bridges and our culverts, to get that package to your house. I see no problem with that. And I would be happy to pay another $1 for all the Amazon deliveries to go to my house. That wouldn't bother me. There's lots of things we can look at. But let me talk about the task force real quick, Jeremy. The task force, in a lot of ways, was lucky, was fortunate in its timing. You mentioned the fair share money. When the fair share money came in, the projections were actually low. We found over the 1-year life of the task force, those numbers were really, really high. So that made our job easy. We could sit back and say, you know what, let's just use that money. Now, some of us on the task force thought we needed to go a little bit further. Some of us thought that that was too far. This was a very good compromise, and I'm happy with the work that the task force did. But I do think it's time, as we come into the next gubernatorial administration, next January, that we start looking at what's next. And let me be very clear, we don't need another commission, task force, study, committee, panel. I've served on like 9 of them at this point. We don't need to study this more. We need to do stuff. When did we stop being able to do stuff in this country?
We're going to be taking audience questions in just a couple minutes. A reminder that my colleague Andrew is up here and there's a microphone here. If you want to come up, if you have questions, feel free to start talking with Andrew and lining up behind the microphone. My colleague Annie will also be taking questions that are written. Before we do get to those, Viviana, I wanted to ask you, as we're talking about practical solutions, not just congestion pricing, which might be far down the road. What practical solutions do you think we could do, not necessarily today?
Revenue?
Yeah, for transportation.
Well, revenue in general. Let's just talk about that because, the proposal that is being put by these corporations is actually to reduce the state revenue. So when Brian is talking about, what else can we do? We don't need a study. We need to, I don't know what is the environment and the ability of the legislature to increase taxes right now. And if there is some kind of possibility for it. Let's just start with that, because something that we thought it was going to be very easy, which is decoupling from the OBBBA corporate tax, which Michigan, New York, Jersey, Maine, Rhode Island, they have all decoupled. So those states that automatically opted in and incorporated in their own state tax system these corporate tax cuts just stopped it and said, like, I cannot afford to lose hundreds of millions of dollars. Massachusetts hasn't done that, and that's an easy one. The other one that is really easy is what I just talked to you about, which is the global intangible low tax income, which increases the portion that the state is going to tax for these corporations that multinational, multi-million-dollar corporations that hide money in tax havens. Every state in New England taxes 50%. Massachusetts hasn't done it. We are only at 5%. So we're talking about that the state could generate, over $600 million more. Those are easy. Now, putting more regressive taxes like sales taxes in any form, like we saw 2 years ago, the proposal of taxing candy, that is regressive. Let's just make sure that we are taxing those that can pay. Those that have the most should contribute the most to the public good. So, but I really don't know if there is the possibility currently in the State House of pushing for more taxes to address the public needs when we are seeing that the state is maybe, hopefully not considering a back deal in how it is that we are going to try to prevent these ballot questions from getting to the ballot. So I don't, you know better than me, how is the state thinking about more taxes?
Representative Sabadosa, yeah. I mean, how are legislators thinking of this? Are you supportive of any of these ideas?
I mean, I personally am
taxes?
supportive of many of these ideas, although I would say I think we are in an affordability crisis in the state, so pushing forward regressive taxes is something that I think is actually quite dangerous right now. I mean, we have a lot of very low-income people. We talk about people leaving Massachusetts, but what we are really seeing is people who are lower income and who can't make ends meet leaving the state. I think the revenue from the fair share is showing it's not the billionaires, but it's the people who are struggling to make rent, who are looking for cheaper destinations. So we do have to be careful about how we raise taxes and how we raise fees and who that actually impacts. I mean, I think at the end of the day, what happens with this ballot question is going to determine what the legislature has the appetite to do, right? We're all really, I think, very concerned that the question may move forward. I will say I'm probably more optimistic than a lot of my colleagues, and it may be by virtue of the district that I represent. We voted overwhelmingly for the fair share, like at high 80% numbers. And I think that in my district, if you explain to people, do you want your taxes cut? They say, sure, I'd love to have my taxes cut. When you say, would you like your taxes cut? And by the way, we're not going to fill those potholes, and also we're going to be cutting money from the schools. People are like, no, we do not want that. And I think if that message gets out to people that that is what this ballot question will do, we will see voters turn out against it. But right now, the message has really just been, your taxes will go down, and this isn't a tax break for the wealthy, which, given the capital gains decrease that's coupled with it, it absolutely is.
Beyond this ballot measure, what's the conversation like among your colleagues about potential future revenue sources, things like congestion pricing?
I think congestion pricing, there's been a lot of conversation around it. I mean, we understand that it's more a city of Boston question. From my perspective, I want answers as to how my constituents are going to get into work, how I'm going to get into work, because I don't have that luxury. So it is really about buoying the whole transportation system so that we are getting people out of cars in general, and that is my focus.
We have a question from somebody who wrote into us online and said one of the main avenues of arrival to the state is the airport or even the seaports. How are Massport facilities involved in this conversation? Brian, Massport is a big partner with the MBTA. The T's huge for getting to and from the airport. How does that factor into this?
Massport is a great partner for the T. They just released a 10-year capital plan, I want to say a month ago, that was focused on getting more folks into and out of Logan in ways other than in single occupancy vehicles. I was a little disappointed in it that it didn't have better connections from the Blue Line to the terminals. I think we've all been to airports where if you can walk from the terminal or from baggage claim and get on the train, it's a lot easier than having to take that shuttle bus. That one extra step just makes a huge difference. And I also believe if we could couple something like a central airport station coupled with a red-blue connector, you're looking at the opportunity to get from somewhere like Revere or somewhere like Kendall Square to the airport in 20 minutes, walk to security, and possibly be at your gate in less than an hour. That's a game changer.
Yeah.
Now, what Massport has done, I think, is great. It's smart. It's what we have to offer with. They're looking at some innovative things, and I give Rich Davey and those folks a lot of credit. I do think, though, however, this sort of lack of vision thing that I mentioned is systemic across all of the Commonwealth. We're sort of stuck in an austerity mindset in a lot of ways, and we need to find ways to get out of it because it's not going to make Massachusetts better.
We've been having a lot of discussion about how difficult the situation is for funding. Viviana, you said that you feel the Fair Share Amendment has been a success. Can we dive a little bit deeper into the benefits that we've seen so far? I mean, this was a huge landmark law that voters passed. How are we feeling it change our lives every day?
So I think that the investments in education are more tangible to the Massachusetts residents. So when you, let me give you an example, free community college. This is something that you see, and it's advertised, and free meals for every school kid, regardless of their household income, and more money into the success grants that go into the four-year, the state universities. So with transportation, it is less tangible because there is a lot of investment going on. But if you think about the impact that the Fair Share has had in terms of increasing equity and equity investments. So free community college, for example, is not only about making sure that Massachusetts residents have no out-of-pocket cost to complete an associate degree. It's also a strategy for workforce development. And we have not measured that as well as we should. In terms of the school meals, we know that the federal government is stepping back in supporting SNAP benefits, and that the state is going to receive a strong and palpable budget cut, and that the partnership that we used to have, that the federal government paid 100% of the benefits and the state will pay 50% of the administration of the benefit, that partnership has been altered. At least we can make sure that our children are going to have 2 meals that are healthy and good per day in the school. So we don't know how that's, like 1 in every 6 residents have access to SNAP benefits. So imagine how much we are going to be affecting our poor and low-income populations. So I think that in the next years, we are going to start seeing the impact of the Fair Share. It's only been 3 years. So I think that we are going to start measuring the impact on affordability. And the Fair Share has been the most progressive policy that the state has enacted in years. And it was through the vote of its citizens. So kudos, because Massachusetts people knew how to vote and how to increase revenue for the public good. And that is fantastic. I think that you have more too.
No, just when you're talking about the impact of the Fair Share, a few things come to mind. I mean, we talked about fare-free buses on the RTAs. That has been a game changer. You have seen ridership increase. It is people taking advantage of free community colleges because they can get there. It's people getting to work on buses and not stressing about right change or have they paid on the app or is the app working because there's not always reliable cell phone service in the whole state. So it really does make a huge difference. In Western Massachusetts, there are programs that we're really taking advantage of. There is a new microtransit program where it's helping to pay for example, Valley Bike, which is a bike share program that runs up and down the Connecticut River Valley. We have a great train service that brings us to New York, not to Boston yet, but we'll get there. And when you get off that train and you're a college student and you're trying to get back to your dorm, you can take the bike. We didn't have a way of funding that before, and the towns were struggling to figure that out. Fair Share has given us an avenue to do that. We've talked a lot about the MBTA, but in Western Massachusetts, we have unpaved roads. We have a lot of unpaved roads. There is now funding to help maintain those roads that did not exist before. It does not come through your Chapter 90 dollars, and they require a different sort of maintenance, and they're really, really important to the people who live in these communities. So the Fair Share, I would say, has been a tremendous game changer, and the effects of that are something we're seeing right now, and we can go home and say to people, the Fair Share dollars are paying for that, and we can point to the changes that they're seeing in their community. And that is, I think, critical for continued support of progressive revenue in the state.
We have an audience question here.
My name's Chris, and how are we going to make sure that bus drivers are getting the proper training? I was running around the city quite a bit today, and I got lied to about where my destination was or which bus was going to which destination by multiple drivers. So respectfully, I'd like to know how this can be amended. How can we make sure this kind of stuff doesn't happen to people like myself? I am disabled, I am neurodivergent, and while I may look naive, I'm not stupid.
Brian, the T has made major strides in, re-upping its workforce after it diminished for several years. A big part of that has been a huge hiring push of bus drivers, but we're hearing about the difficulty of, potential bus drivers potentially not having the training that they need. How do you mesh, expanding or getting service back to the point it needs to be, but not losing oversight of keeping that service good?
So I can't speak for the MBTA, but I'm terribly sorry that happened to you. It should not happen. It's ridiculous, and I'm very sorry. The T, I can tell you, has increased its training for bus drivers, but clearly it's not good enough. One thing that I'm going to say that's probably a little controversial is we need to have consequences for MBTA employees who do not do their job and do it well, including disciplinary action, including termination. Sounds like this is certainly grounds for termination to me. I don't know enough about the details, so we can't go there right now. But one thing that I would suggest is that as the T gets the more money and does do the hiring that it's been doing and is increasing its training, there needs to be on the back end some additional ways for the MBTA to get rid of those bad apples. Not every single one of the 8,000 employees is a gem. There's always a few bad ones, and we need to find ways to get rid of those folks quicker and better so that this experience is never repeated again, because it is completely unacceptable.
Maybe not just go straight to firing them, but I would like to, maybe we can encourage them to be better, Like,
sure.
There could be penalties or something, I don't know, but
I mean, the handbook is this thick of what they're supposed to do, and I'd be happy to share that with you if I can.
In a workplace, if someone messes up, like if there's harassment in a workplace, someone has to take, like, in an office environment, they have to take, like, training and, like, seminars to not be a harasser, right? So maybe there could be, like, training and seminars for this specifically.
Well, there are seminars for specifically for interacting with folks with disabilities.
Maybe they
but
need to
not
retake
always.
it.
They're not always followed. And what I'm suggesting is that if they're not followed and there's a pattern of it, that person probably
How
shouldn't
do
be
we
driving
know
a
that
bus.
these people, one, attended the seminar, and two, retained the information?
So, I mean, I haven't worked at the T in about 8 years, but when I was there, it was absolutely required. You couldn't log into your computer or check into work after a certain point if you hadn't gone through the training. So it is absolutely a requirement for folks to do it. What we can't guarantee is that once they've learned it, they're actually practicing it.
Thank you very much for the question and for the comments. And one other thing I think worth mentioning is that the T has also been doing work for bus drivers to avoid being fatigued on the job. There was a recent crash in Medford involving a bus driver, and in response to that, the T has been trying to do more fatigue awareness training for their bus drivers. I want to make sure that we can get to the future in Massachusetts with transportation funding. We've mentioned some ideas of the possibilities of new revenue sources, but let's talk about if things stay the same they are right now. We have the Fair Share Amendment, which all of you have said has been huge in some way or another for transportation and education in Massachusetts. Viviana, if things stay the same right now, what happens to the state budget and the money that we have for transportation?
Let me just ask you, so you're talking about, like if the funding that was supposed to get to the state from the federal government, all of those grants that were canceled, like that.
Federal grants canceled.
Yes.
We keep the fair share in
Yes.
effect, but we don't find new revenue sources of any kind.
So, one of the things that, and Brian talked about this when he showed his graph. So, the better the state gets into estimating the revenue of the fair share, the less money we're going to have in a supplemental budget for that specific amount of money that tends to go into one-time investments and tend to be capital. So it's exactly what Brian said, like after 2030, once the state is getting better and better to project how much money, and it's budgeted in every year's state budget, less money for infrastructure there's going to be. So I think that if things stay as they are, it's going to be really hard for Massachusetts to have a state-of-the-art 21st century transportation system. And when we were prepping for this conversation, we talked, and Brian, when I said, like is not only a Massachusetts problem, but we don't have these speed trains that can move you from the east to the west coast like you can go in other countries in Europe and Asia. Mm-hmm. So Massachusetts infrastructure, it's just a reflection of the infrastructure across the country. So, like in the first administration of the current president, there was the silver lining that there was an interest and common denominator of passing a big infrastructure bill. That did not really happen. The money did not come down to the states. And, like when we look into other transportation systems in other countries, the United States is really behind. And I don't think we're going to be able to catch up. So like Brian, do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Just on the T side, the $24 billion backlog needs about $1.2 billion a year just to stop growing larger every year. Mm-hmm. Now, with that said, I do firmly believe that Phil Eng and his leadership team at the T will continue to optimize the system we have. It has certainly gotten significantly better since he joined in 2023, and I am really grateful to this governor for bringing him in. I've seen 9 general managers in my career, and he's by far the best. So, if status quo continued, we will continue to optimize the system we have. Things will get a little bit better in terms of how close the trains run together. Things will get a little bit better. But we're never going to take that next step to bring the Commonwealth to where it needs to be. We are no longer competing here in Boston with just cities and towns in Massachusetts and New England in the United States. We are competing with the Singapores, we are competing with the Zurichs, we are competing with all sorts of tier 1 global international cities, and they are kicking our rear ends in terms of infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And it shows. So when are we going to get serious about this? And I think the first step to getting serious about it, Jeremy, is to let's get a plan we can all agree to. God knows there's been enough plans, I said that earlier. God knows there's been enough reports. God knows there's been enough stuff. Let's pick one of those off a shelf, blow the dust off of it, and decide we as a people are going to do this. Whether it's East-West Rail or Compass Rail, Red-Blue Connector, there's a ton of projects that we could do that I think would really begin to make Massachusetts move in the right direction. And it kick us up a notch in terms of what we can do. Because once that momentum comes, and I think Felling has shown this at the T, once the momentum begins and we're starting to make real progress, it's hard to stop. We just got to get started. And I believe we can. We just need to choose to.
We have another audience question that I'd like to get to.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the conversation. My name is Seth Gaboys. I'm a Boston resident. Happy to be here today. Fair share passing was a democratic signal that the people of the Commonwealth want those with well above average resources to contribute proportionally for everyone's benefit. Ideally, the branches of the Commonwealth would then take that democratic signal and replicate it. And I think that I've heard like various ideas to this effect have come up today, but essentially, have you all seen this replication happen? And for the near future, what would that replication look like in each branch of government, particularly with an election on the horizon and the question of a permanent MassDOT secretary?
Representative Sabadosa, I'm curious your thoughts on that. You know, is the legislature feeling the resounding success and voter support of the Fair Share Amendment as you look towards future legislation that you could pass when it comes to funding for not just transportation, but the Commonwealth broadly?
I think the legislature does feel the success of fair share, for sure. And I think that that's why, you know, the legislature, we've talked so much about the ballot question, but there's been a lot of debate about, oh, should there be some sort of compromise? And the legislature has really stood firm and said, no, there shouldn't be a compromise. The people of the Commonwealth have said that they want this progressive taxation system, and we're not going to try to make it more regressive. I do think there is some caution because of federal headwinds, that's for sure, and we need to do that. I mean, we would be disrespecting the people of the Commonwealth if we didn't take everything that is being thrown at us really very seriously. We mentioned SNAP, we mentioned health care. There's, the current presidential budget has an $8 billion cut in education funding. We have to be very aware of all of that. So we are trying to be judicious, but I think we've understood that there's a mandate, yes.
I want to ask each of you before we close our conversation. It was mentioned that we have a governor's race coming up. So my final question is, regardless of who is in office, what's your advice for the next governor when it comes to funding for transportation and the future of transportation? Viviana, I'll begin with you and go down the line.
Oh, wow. I will not get paid to be her advisor, but, let me just say this. She's very, very focused and interested in Massachusetts' competitiveness.
Governor Healy, you're
yes.
referring to? Yes.
And the state, they are commissions and, you mentioned them all, commissions and teams and about making Massachusetts more competitive. I think that if you look about, investing in the public good, which is investing in transportation, investing in affordable, accessible, high-quality care and education, making sure that housing is affordable. That's what's going to make Massachusetts competitive. It's not tax cuts for the rich, and it is not tax cuts for rich corporations. What it's going to attract businesses, it's going to be the quality of life and the services that the government can provide for the common good. So I will advise to whoever is coming, just think about being competitive outside of cutting taxes for corporations and for the rich, but in providing services that are going to make people's lives better in the whole Commonwealth. That will be my advice.
Brian, your thoughts. Should competitiveness be top of mind?
So depending on who wins the election, if Governor Healy came to me and asked me, I would say...
would you get paid?
Continue, I doubt it.
Okay.
Continue, not after what I said today.
Okay.
Continue to be bold. Continue to be bold.
Yeah.
Retain Phil Eng, but find the next Phil Eng or Phil Engs.
Oh.
We can't just have one hero that saves the day over and over and over again. We need that next level, that next generation, I should say, to come forward. I would, if it's not Governor Healy, I would absolutely say austerity does not work in transportation. It will fail. Things will get worse. People will get hurt. People might die. Trains will catch on fire on a bridge over the Saugus River again, and we'll be jumping off of them. Austerity fails.
Representative Sabadosa, what do you think the governor's office, regardless of who's in it, should be thinking of in the next years?
I love the austerity fails mantra. I think we should make that a campaign slogan. But I guess the other thing that I would say is, again, bringing a Western Mass perspective, you need to get out across the state. You need to be thinking about every corner, and you need to be figuring out how there is a plan for Massachusetts. For us to be able to move across our own state, for us to be able to get jobs in different areas without picking up our lives and moving. You can't leave a part of the state behind. And I think that whoever the next governor is needs to have that at the forefront of their talking points when they're out there campaigning, because there are communities, frankly, that feel left behind, and it is not, it's not acceptable.
State Representative Lindsay Sabadosa, Brian Kane of the MBTA Advisory Board, and Dr. Viviana Abreu-Hernández of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. Thank you all so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to everybody who joined us in the audience here at the Newsfeed Cafe at the Boston Public Library. Thank you to everybody who's been joining us on our live stream on YouTube. Thank you to the Newsfeed Cafe and Boston Public Library staff, to the GBH Forum staff, and thank you to Transportation for Massachusetts for putting on this event. I'm Jeremy Siegel. I really appreciate all of you joining us this afternoon. I think our panelists may be hanging around for a minute or two afterwards, so they might be able to answer any lingering questions you have. I'm going to be on deadline for a story, so I'll probably have my headphones in a chair over here filing that. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day.